The Harley-Davidson roared beneath him, a beast unleashed on the open road. The engine's vibrations coursed through his veins, a deep resonance that matched the pounding of his heart. Each twist of the throttle sent a surge of power through his body, the kind of raw energy that made him feel invincible. The wind whipped against his face, sharp and biting, while his leather jacket creaked with each lean, a symphony of worn leather and rebellion. He moved as one with the machine, every motion fluid and effortless. His dark eyes held a depth both magnetic and dangerous, and the way his hands gripped the handlebars spoke of practiced confidence. The motorcycle, black as midnight, wasn't just a vehicle. It was an extension of himself. Together, they cut a figure that dared the world to challenge them, a silhouette that made men step aside and women linger, their gazes filled with intrigue and caution. He was a wild thing. Untouchable. A man who forged his own path, living by his own code, exuding a confidence that dripped like sweat under the summer sun. He was aware of the effect he had, the way conversations hushed when he entered a room, the way eyes followed him, filled with a mix of fear and fascination. But he didn't care. The world could chase him all it wanted. He was always a step ahead, a ghost on the wind. Bound to the rumble of his bike, he had no intention of slowing down for anyone. But it hadn't always been this way. Once he was invisible, a shadow flitting through the hallways of a life that overlooked him. In 7th grade, he was the kid who blended into the background, the one whose name teachers forgot and peers ignored. His clothes were hand-me-downs, faded and worn, shoes scuffed from years of use. Lunch times were spent alone at the corner table, picking at sandwiches made from yesterday's leftovers. He remembered the sting of being shoved against cold lockers, the metallic clang echoing down the corridor as his books scattered like fallen leaves. The laughter of his tormentors, sharp and cruel, still echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of his insignificance. "Hey, watch where you're going, loser," one would sneer, shoving past him. "Maybe if you had friends, you wouldn't be such a freak," another taunted, knocking his glasses off his face. He'd scramble to gather his things, cheeks burning, wishing he could disappear entirely. The world was a cold place for someone like him, overlooked, underestimated, unseen. At home, things weren't much better. His father worked long hours at the factory, coming home exhausted and irritable. His mother had left years ago, the memory of her smile fading with each passing day. Evenings were spent in silence, the flicker of the old television casting shadows on peeling wallpaper. The house creaked and groaned, a reflection of the emptiness inside. One rainy afternoon, seeking refuge from a sudden downpour, he ducked into a dilapidated garage sale. It was an unassuming event on a quiet street, tables laden with trinkets from a bygone era, the detritus of a life packed away. The house behind it sagged with age, paint peeling like dead skin. The old woman who owned it moved slowly among the items, her eyes distant, as if lost in memories only she could see. Rumors swirled about her, that she'd lost her husband and son under tragic, inexplicable circumstances. Whispers hinted at curses, at dark secrets best left undisturbed. But he was drawn to the motorcycle. She stood apart from the clutter, parked in the driveway as if waiting just for him. A Harley-Davidson unlike any he'd seen, sleek lines and polished chrome that seemed to drink in the sunlight even through the overcast sky. Shadows clung to her edges, and for a moment he swore the air around her hummed. He approached slowly, running a tentative hand along the smooth metal of the gas tank. The touch sent a jolt through him, like static electricity. "Beautiful, isn't she?" The old woman's voice startled him. He turned to face her. Up close, her eyes were a startling shade of green, piercing and knowing. "Yes," he managed to reply. "She's incredible." She nodded, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "She was my son's. He loved her more than anything." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly. She waved a frail hand dismissively. "All things come to an end, one way or another." He hesitated, then asked, "How much are you asking for her?" She studied him, her gaze searching deep into his own. "She needs the right rider," she murmured. "Someone who understands her." I can take care of her," he promised, a strange desperation creeping into his voice. "But I don't have much money." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Money isn't everything. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement." He blinked in surprise. "What kind of arrangement?" "She chooses who rides her," the old woman said cryptically. If she wants you, she's yours. He felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to possess the bike. I want to try, he said firmly. She nodded slowly. Very well. She handed him the keys, the metal warm against his palm. He swung a leg over the seat, settling into the saddle. The bike seemed to mold to his body, fitting him perfectly. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life, the sound resonating deep within his chest. It was as if the bike was alive, acknowledging him. He looked back at the old woman, who watched with a knowing expression. Treat her well, she said softly. She brings out what's already there. He didn't understand her words then, but he would soon enough. From the moment he rode the bike home, he felt it, a connection, electric and undeniable. The engine's purr resonated in his chest, syncing with his heartbeat. As he rode, the world blurred at the edges, and for the first time he felt seen. Powerful. At school the next day, things shifted. When one of his usual tormentors tried to trip him, he sidestepped effortlessly, a sly grin tugging at his lips. What's so funny? The bully growled. He met the bully's gaze head-on. Try that again, he dared. A crowd gathered as fists flew, but this time he wasn't the one on the ground. The crack of knuckles against jawbone echoed in the hushed hallway. Gasps rose from the onlookers as the bully staggered back, shock written across his face. Who the hell do you think you are? The bully spat, clutching his bleeding nose. Someone you don't want to mess with, he replied coldly. From that day forward, the whispers in the halls weren't about him being a target. They were about him being dangerous. He began to change, not just in the way he carried himself, but physically. His once slender frame filled out with lean muscle. His eyes, once downcast, now held a fierce intensity. Teachers began to take notice, wary of the new presence he exuded. At home, his father barely recognized him. You've been acting different lately, he remarked one evening over a silent dinner. Just growing up, he replied dismissively. Don't get into trouble, his father warned, but there was no conviction in his voice. Nights were spent riding endless roads, the line between him and the machine blurring. The hum of the engine wasn't just mechanical, it spoke to him, a low whisper at the edge of hearing. They're weak, it seemed to say. Take what's yours. He started with small acts, cutting lines at the diner, taking what he wanted without paying. No one dared confront him. The thrill was intoxicating, but the whispers grew louder. One night, under a blood-red moon, he found himself at the edge of town, staring down at the city lights below. The bike idled beneath him. They're all beneath you, the voice hissed. Show them your power. He revved the engine, the roar echoing into the night. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, shadows stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. He didn't question the whispers anymore. They felt like a part of him, a truth he had always known but never acknowledged. The first robbery was almost too easy. The adrenaline rush as he emptied the cash register, the look of terror in the clerk's eyes, it ignited something dark within him. Please don't hurt me, the clerk begged. He smirked. Then don't give me a reason to. Each act of violence fed the hunger growing inside. Fights became bloodier, the stakes higher. He relished the headlines. Unknown assailant strikes again, and the way the world seemed to tremble at his presence. Women were drawn to him like moths to a flame. They loved the danger, the thrill of being close to someone so untamed. He took what he wanted from them, never staying long enough for attachments. Yet in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, doubts crept in. One evening, as he sat alone in a roadside diner, a young waitress approached his table. Coffee? She offered, her eyes lingering on his. He nodded. You look familiar, she said thoughtfully. Have we met before? Don't think so, he replied curtly. She hesitated. You remind me of someone I knew, someone I cared about. He glanced up, meeting her gaze. For a moment, he saw a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps. Must be mistaken, he said, looking away. As she walked away, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite place. Regret? Loneliness? But the whispers returned, drowning out the fleeting emotion. She's nothing, they insisted. They all are. Back on the road, he pushed the bike harder, faster. The line between reality and the whispers blurred. He began to see shadows moving at the edges of his vision, dark shapes that seemed to follow him. One night, stranded on a desolate stretch of desert road, the bike stalled, inexplicably. The silence was deafening. Stars spread across the sky like cold, distant eyes. Come on, he muttered, trying the ignition. Nothing. The whispers began, a cacophony of voices, not just one. You need us. Embrace us. There's no turning back. Shadows seemed to stretch toward him, the air thick with menace. Who's there? He shouted, spinning around. But he was alone. Or was he? He wondered then if the darkness came from the bike or from within himself. Memories flooded back, the loneliness, the yearning to be noticed, the bitterness that had festered over the years. Maybe the bike didn't change him. Maybe it just unveiled who he truly was. He shook off the thoughts as the engine roared back to life on its own. The road called, and he couldn't resist. But the thrill began to wane. The more he took, the emptier he felt. Faces blurred together, terrified clerks, defeated opponents, nameless women who clung to him for a night and vanished by morning. Desperate for escape, he returned to the old woman's house, seeking answers. The property was abandoned, the house now a charred skeleton. Firefighters milled about, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burnt wood. What happened? He asked a bystander. Lightning strike, the man replied. Old place went up like tinder. A chill ran down his spine. He approached a firefighter. Was anyone inside? The man shook his head. Found something, though. He handed over a scorched photograph, the image barely discernible. It was a faded picture of the old woman standing beside a younger man, a man who looked eerily like himself, next to the very same motorcycle. Confusion and dread coiled within him. Who is this? He whispered, but the firefighter had already turned away. He realized then that the path he was on wasn't just of his own making. The bike had a history, a legacy of darkness passed from rider to rider. Back on the road, he felt the weight of countless souls bearing down on him. The whispers were relentless now, a constant drone urging him toward oblivion. One night, he pulled into a small town seeking rest. He found a motel on the outskirts, the neon sign flickering weakly. The receptionist eyed him warily as he paid for a room. In the solitude of the cramped space, he stared at himself in the mirror. Shadows under his eyes, stubble lining his jaw, but it was his eyes that startled him. They seemed darker, almost black, with a depth that was unsettling. What have I become? He murmured. A knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. Who is it? He called out. Housekeeping, a soft voice replied. I didn't ask for, but the door swung open, revealing the young waitress from the diner. You, he breathed. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. I had to find you, she said, her eyes intense. How did you? Doesn't matter, she cut him off. I know what you've been doing. He tensed. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, she insisted. I can help you. He laughed bitterly. Help me? No one can help me. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small pendant, a silver charm shaped like a crescent moon. Take this, she urged. It can protect you. From what? From the darkness consuming you, she said, stepping closer. I know about the bike. His eyes narrowed. What do you know? More than you think, she replied. My grandmother warned me about you. Your grandmother? The old woman who sold you the bike, she revealed. She was my grandmother. Shock rippled through him. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't realize it was you at first, she admitted. But when I saw you, I felt something. He backed away. This is insane. Please, she pleaded. You can break the cycle. You don't have to end up like the others. The others? You're not the first, she said softly. The bike chooses those with darkness in their hearts. It feeds on it, amplifies it. He clenched his fists. Maybe I don't want to change. She looked at him sadly. I think you do. For a moment he considered her words. The weight of his actions pressed upon him, a suffocating blanket of guilt and despair. How? He asked quietly. Destroy the bike, she said simply. He shook his head. I can't. You can, she insisted. You must. The whispers rose, louder than ever. Don't listen to her, they hissed. She's lying. He pressed his hands to his temples. Stop it, he groaned. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Fight it, she urged. The room seemed to spin, shadows creeping along the walls. Get out, he snarled, pulling away. Not until you promise to try, she stood her ground. Leave, he shouted, the lights flickering violently. She stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered before turning and fleeing the room. Alone, he sank to the floor, the whispers consuming him. You don't need her. You don't need anyone. He knew then that he was losing himself completely. In a final act of desperation, he grabbed the pendant she had left behind, clutching it tightly. A warmth spread through his hand, momentarily silencing the voices. He made his decision. Before dawn, he rode to the highest cliff overlooking the sea. The sky was painted with the faint hues of morning, the air crisp and still. He dismounted, standing beside the bike. "It's over," he said aloud. The engine revved on its own, a growl of defiance. He placed the pendant on the seat. "Thank you for the ride," he murmured. With a deep breath, he pushed the bike toward the edge. It resisted, wheels skidding, but he pressed on. As the bike teetered on the brink, the whispers turned to screams. "Don't do this! You need us!" He hesitated, a pang of doubt slicing through him. But then he thought of the waitress, of the kindness in her eyes, the hope she had offered. He gave one final shove. The bike plummeted over the edge, disappearing into the crashing waves below. Silence enveloped him. He sank to his knees, the weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt free. But as he stood to leave, a chilling realization settled in. The whispers were gone, but the darkness remained. Weeks later, he found himself back in the small town, working odd jobs, trying to piece his life together. The waitress, Amelia, he learned, helped him find a place to stay. "Why are you helping me?" he asked one evening as they sat on a park bench, the setting sun casting golden hues. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," she replied softly. "Even someone like me? Especially someone like you." He managed a small smile. "I don't know who I am anymore." "Then start fresh," she suggested. "Be who you want to be." He nodded slowly, a glimmer of hope igniting within. But in the shadows, something stirred. Back at the base of the cliff, among the jagged rocks, the mangled remains of the motorcycle lay submerged. Moonlight filtered through the water, illuminating the twisted metal. A faint hume emanated from the depths, growing steadily louder. The cycle was not broken. It was just beginning anew.
In the tale of Hellbound Harley, we've traveled the winding roads of fate, where the line between choice and destiny is as blurred as the spectral figure haunting my peripheral vision. Harley's story, much like the shadows cast in the corners of my quaint Ravenwood home, reminds us that the unseen is often as real as the tangible, and the voices of the past echo in the silence of the present. Now I ask you, dear listeners, to ponder this. How often do we dismiss the strange and inexplicable out of fear or disbelief? What truths might we uncover if we dared to listen to the whispers in the dark, to peer into the shadows and question the unknown? I want to thank you for joining me on this eerie journey tonight. Remember, new episodes of Twisted Tales unfold every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Until we meet again under the spectral glow of the moon, keep your curiosity alive and your fear at bay. For in Ravenwood, and perhaps in your world too, every shadow holds a secret waiting to be revealed.